Hello, everybody. How are you? Welcome back. Today we're going to talk about historic archaeology, and let me give you a little advanced apology. I'm recording at home in a not particularly romantic but quiet spot. If you're not watching this immediately after this, some future semester, we're in the middle of the COVID-19 closure, so I'm at home. So if you see a child or a dog sprint through the screen, that's what's going on there. But today we're going to talk about historical archaeology. This is the kind of archaeology that I do. As its name suggests, historical archaeology is archaeology done during the historic period. What does that mean? What is a historic period? Historic period is any time that you have historical records that you can use in conjunction with the archaeological record that you're finding in a site. So this means that this is a moving target, right? Depending on where you are in the world, the historical period, quote unquote, the period when historical records appear, is different. So in some places that might be thousands of years ago, and in some places that might be only 100 or 200 years ago. So for instance, here in Connecticut, where I do my work and where we'll see some case studies from today, some examples from today, the historical period starts in the early 17th century, the early 1600s, when Europeans arrive, because they bring with them writing, and for the most part, with some sort of interesting exceptions, Native North Americans did not have a writing system. That doesn't mean that there isn't knowledge from Native Americans that has been passed down since before the historic period. There certainly is. We call this oral history, things that are passed down through oral means, and that is very similar to looking at historical documents, but it's a little bit of an old-fashioned thing. But we designate these periods based on these two things. So archaeology in a whole is kind of divided into two camps: prehistoric archaeology, basically everything we've talked about up till this point, kind of, although we have talked about some historical record-bearing cultures in this class, including Egypt and Mesopotamia, we split those periods in the prehistoric and the historic period. So historical archaeology, I've got some little points here about some of the big ticket sort of thoughts on historical archaeology. It tends to be used to complement and cross-check the written record. So we're using it in conjunction with historical record. So being a historical archaeologist, you usually have to have some training. As a historian, you usually have to have some experience working with different kinds of historical documentation. The fact of the matter is that even in the historical period, most people did not write down histories. So other than elite people, we usually don't have historical records about them. We talked about that a little bit when I was talking about Mesopotamia, I think, earlier in the course, and certainly this is true of Egypt as well. Early writing in those civilizations was really only about ultra elites, very wealthy people, pharaohs, whatever. And that continues to be true even into the colonial period in North America, for instance. We have to think archaeology is still a really important part of this. We also have this thing here, this third one here, check on assumptions of prehistoric archaeology. Essentially, this means that we've learned a lot from historical archaeology that we can then apply back to prehistoric archaeology. For instance, I've got here artifact form, not necessarily logical or adaptive. There's a tendency in prehistoric archaeology to assume that humans are sort of logical actors, and then when they make a tool, they're going to use it for the thing we think they might use it for looking at it today. The reality is that historical archaeology has taught us that that's not always the case. We can use the historical record to see that sometimes things have surprising uses, or they have surprising meanings for the people who use them. I'm going to get past these text-heavy slides here in just a moment, but the other thing about historical archaeology is it tends to be focused on topics that are relevant to these so-called historic periods. So prehistoric archaeologists don't necessarily have to think about these things, and historical archaeologists think about them a lot because they're super relevant to the time periods that we're usually studying. So for instance, colonialism, that is to say cultures coming in contact with each other where there's power differentials. I'm going to talk about that today. This is largely what I study, right? So Native Americans coming in contact with Euro-Americans, coming in contact with enslaved Africans. There's power dynamics there. there. There's people who are being disenfranchised, and all kinds of interesting, sometimes difficult topics to think about, but historical archaeologists tend to be very interested in those sorts of questions. Pluralism, same, which is an extension of the same thing, right? So what this means is that during the historic period, usually you're talking about very cosmopolitan societies with people from lots of different parts of the world. This is true in ancient historical societies as well as more modern ones. So, when we think about Egypt, again, for instance, right, a historical society, also a very pluralistic society. There were certainly people, there were Greeks and Phoenicians and whatever else, people from all over the world probably visiting Egypt, trading with Egypt. So it's a kind of a pluralistic society, and this is true more recent examples as well. Things like industrialism and industrial development, macroeconomics, capitalism, socialism, democracy, authoritarianism, and all of these kinds of topics of quote-unquote modernity. So things that historians tend to be really interested in, economists tend to be really interested in, sociologists tend to be really interested in. Historical archaeologists have a lot more focus on those things than prehistoric archaeologists, because those things don't really exist in ancient societies, or if they do, it's in a way that's so different that you have to think about it really differently. I've got here these terms, a couple of problematic terms. I've already talked about historic versus prehistoric. That's seen as somewhat problematic because to be a prehistoric society means that you live before history, right? That's what that name sort of implies. And I think a lot of indigenous people find that onerous because of course their ancestors were not prehistoric. They had history just like anybody else. So even though this term really in this context is talking about the written record, this is still a problematic term. Contact versus pre-contact, the same way. We often talk about the earliest period of the historic period as the contact period. So this is Europeans, explorers, and settlers moving out to the rest of the world and quote-unquote contacting indigenous people from all over the world. This has been critiqued as a really weak term for what was an extremely destructive and momentous moment in history in many ways. And also, I sort of alluded to this too, historical archaeologists tend to focus on small histories as opposed to elite histories, like say maybe an art historian might have to, right? Or even a regular historian might have to, because again, like I said, in most cases, most histories and historical documents are written about elites. In archaeology, we can talk about non-elites because we are looking at archaeological sites, which are sort of democratized in a sense, right? They don't have all these. They're not populated by elites necessarily. Some cases they might be, but in most cases they're not, because the majority of households or sites are not going to be associated with elites because there aren't that many elites, right? That's what makes them elite. Some of the kinds of historical records that are typical, and artifacts that are pretty typical. Some of these we've talked about before. Probate records, which are very boring but very, very useful tools. House architecture, which I'm going to talk about as a kind of case study example in a little while. Mortuary art, so we look at gravestones. Pottery and ceramics, we learned early in the semester about mean ceramic dating and ceramic analysis. This is the very powerful tool in historical archaeology. Pipe stem dating, there's a link here. Of course, you'll have access to this PowerPoint. There's a link here out to Historic Jamestown's website. They've got really cool, you can sort of see what some of these things are. Let me do my first stop there.